Hi, I'm Noe Natsugu, and welcome to the first episode of my podcast, 2020 Vision. Sorry, actually, moving forward 2020 Vision. That's a great way to start the first episode, is to mess up your name. Anyways, the purpose of this podcast is to break down what is decidedly an overcrowded field of Democratic candidates, vying for the nomination to face Donald Trump in next year's general election. Now, between Wednesday and Thursday night's debates, there are 20 candidates on the stage. That is too damn many, and you know it. So, that's where I come in. I'm here to try to centralize all of that information for you. I'm going to be looking at the polling, the news, and even the memes, so that you don't have to. I'll be releasing an introductory video shortly to more explain the format of how I'd like these videos to go generally. However, in light of the debates, the episode tonight and tomorrow night will be strictly about the debates. Anyways, let's get to it. Before I say anything about the debate itself, I feel as though I should at least give you the names of everybody that was involved. So this is night one of 2 nights, and the candidates on stage are Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bill de Blasio, John Delaney, Tulsi Gabbard, Jay Inslee, Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, Tim Ryan, and Elizabeth Warren. Now, just a couple hours after the finish of the debate, we can already see the narratives begin to take place surrounding the debate. Much of the conversation circled around immigration policy, a lot of talk about climate change, a whole section on Mitch McConnell. We saw friction between the candidates. Expectedly, Donald Trump weighed in via Twitter, calling the debate boring. 3 candidates chose to show off their Spanish-speaking prowess. And there was even some minor technical difficulties. So without further ado, let's dive right in. First, I'd like to discuss my winners and losers for the night. This is just based kind of generally off of the narrative surrounding the night, as well as just how I feel each candidate was able to present themselves and able to convey their platform to the people. This is not my opinion on the actual substance per se or the policy, but rather just I feel that they were able to get their message out in a way that will benefit their campaign in the polls. Now, the biggest winner of the night has to be Julian Castro. That is without a doubt. Tonight can be seen as an early breakthrough for his campaign. Polling at just 0.8% coming into tonight, Castro was able to basically dominate a lot of the conversation, almost always asserting himself into every interaction. He had a fiery exchange with Beto O'Rourke over immigration policy, and even himself went on to give a passionate speech on immigration policy reform. If I were president today, he said, I would sign an executive order that would get rid of Trump's zero-tolerance policy, the Remain in Mexico policy, and the metering policy. This metering policy is basically what prompted Oscar and Valeria to make that risky swim across the river. He is, of course, referring to the recently surfaced images of Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his 23-month-old daughter, Valeria, who were found lying face down and dead in the Rio Grande while attempting to cross into the United States. Watching that image of Oscar and his daughter, he says, is heartbreaking. It should also piss us all off. Crud. Okay, I totally butchered that, so I'm going to put a little disclaimer right here and now, because it's a perfect time. I'm trying to do my best not to have to cut this into little pieces and to kind of have a more fluid and natural conversation. However, you will have to bear with me. I have never done anything like this before, where I've had to record myself talking for a long period of time, but I will do my best. Anyways, getting back to it. NBC News reported, citing data from Google Trends, that Castro's saw a surge in the amount of Google searches made of his name following the comments, seeing a rise of 2,400% in the rate that he was being Googled from before. Now, according to information from the NPR news website, I can see that Castro managed to speak for a total of approximately 8 minutes and 13 seconds during the debate, which is good for fifth most out of all 10 candidates. That's middle ground. But keep in mind that he is ahead of just one candidate that's polling ahead of him. However, in that time, he was really able to, I feel, make use of that. Aside from the substance of the policy, I just felt like he brought a lot of passion to the discussion, and a lot of focus was generally on him, especially during that immigration conversation, where he started to, like I said before, create some friction with Beto O'Rourke, who Castro made a main target, despite previously saying just before that Booker, Warren, and Beto all agreed with Castro. Beto then refused to meet Castro's demand, he made a request to all of the other candidates to repeal Section 1325, an immigration law that makes illegal entry into the U.S. a crime. Beto himself refused to get on board with this, citing human trafficking as a concern, and a small scuffle ensued where the two were essentially talking over each other for a solid few seconds. Amy Klobuchar then came in, taking somewhat of a middle ground, also agreeing to a repeal of 1325, however, asking for provisions needed to make sure that an anti-trafficking position is still taken by the government. Tim Ryan was one to agree in the repeal of 1325, both stating that it should only be a civil crime to cross the border and not a legal one. Another winner of the debate, I felt, was Elizabeth Warren, who had an interesting time up there. In the first half, definitely came out strong. Early on, when asked a question regarding the economy, she said that an economy working for the rich and not those in need was, as she said, corruption, plain and simple. This was met by thunderous applause. And she had several moments throughout the debate like this, where she was able to really get her point across, and it was fairly well received by those. She is, of course, the only candidate in the top 5 to have been placed into this debate. So there was nobody really for her to punch up at. She is in third place in the polling right now, so that would have had to be Bernie or Biden anyways, who are both on the other stage, as is Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. Warren would also go down to advocate that politics have too long been owned by corporate monopolies and lobbyists. However, that seems to have been a common sentiment throughout most of the campaigns, so I don't want to necessarily just attribute that to her. It seemed to be, whether it was Tulsi Gabbard talking about corruption driving the military machine, or Cory Booker talking about corporate consolidation and pharmaceuticals, big pharma, or Tim Ryan talking about the little guy being forgotten, and essentially all of the rest. This just seems to be a very common sentiment. And that brings me in to the next winner, who I am a little bit more, I guess, reserved about their performance tonight. He dominated the speech time. It's Cory Booker, by the way. Cory Booker dominated the total speaking time. He finished with about 10 minutes and 58 seconds of speech, which is almost a full minute ahead of anybody else in the debate. However, it seemed a tad redundant. It definitely fit in line with that theme of things just kind of generally surrounding the idea that consolidation with corporations and big pharma is what is driving most of the problems. And I'm not saying that that is not true. However, the sentiment was repeated enough that I think that it cuts into that lead a tad. However, especially on a crowded stage like this one, speaking time overall is very important, and I'm sure that he was able to get his platform across. He spoke well, and I think that he'll get some publicity, good or bad. I guess you could say that free publicity can't be bad publicity anyways, but he'll be one of the more popular memes coming out of this debate because, oh my god, you should have seen it when Beto O'Rourke began speaking in Spanish in his first talking point at the beginning of the night. They showed this little side shot of Booker, and you could just see on his face. For context, he also would go on a few minutes later to speak his own few lines of Spanish, and he just looked absolutely taken aback. I've already seen plenty of jokes about it. I'm sure you'll see them too. But wow, I could not even tell if he was going to laugh or cry. Now, more in the middle ground, I think we have Klobuchar, who I think was on the top end of those in the middle ground. She did a good job getting her message across. She managed to stay calm, collected, and in the conversation, most importantly. It seemed like there was a little bit less energy in her speech than some of the other candidates. However, through her speaking time, which ranks as fourth most among the candidates, about a minute behind Warren, she was able to really thoroughly convey her campaign and the platform that she's looking to do. I think that in that speaking time also she was able to do what many of the other candidates were honestly able to do, some not, but kind of differentiate their platform from the rest. We see a lot of discussion about immigration reform, healthcare reform, campaign finance reform, and trying to get lobbyist money out of politics. You know, these are things, climate change, these are things that most of the Democrats, for the most part, agree on. But within that, I think that she was really able to differentiate herself in healthcare in a way that a lot of them aren't able to, even though that is a subject that a lot of them are split on between single payer, opt-in, Medicare for all. She, however, endorsed what she calls Medicare Advantage. I won't get too far into it, but I guess it is similar to the idea of Medicare for all or opt-in Medicare, with more of a buffer time in between to eliminate private insurance companies. I'm not too informed on the issue, so I won't get too far into it. That's the gist. She was able to differentiate herself in that sense. I felt that between Ryan and Gabbard and de Blasio, you see kind of like this middle ground. I think that they all definitely were able to get their platforms across as much as they could in the time that they were allowed, in the bottom half of the amount of speaking done during the debate. All three of those are. The reason that they're kind of more middle ground, though, is because as effective as they were, they are all very low polling candidates, and to really gain anything from these debates, they're all going to have to do a lot better, much more like Castro or even Booker, to kind of like dominate and push the conversation and get their names out there more. Notably also, I should mention that there was some friction also between Ryan and Gabbard. This led to the first major gaffe of debate season, actually, when Ryan and Gabbard were discussing interventionist policies, especially in the Middle East. specifically in regards to the Taliban, I believe was the conversation. Ryan spoke of how pulling out of those areas could lead to a deeper fostering of the Taliban and lead them to have more breathing room and time just overall to launch more insurgencies on the U.S. Gabbard was given the opportunity to oppose this, of course, naturally, as her main platform is very anti-interventionist. Based off of what I've read and her campaign ads, I would say that she generally sees interventionism and particularly in the Middle East and Afghanistan as a tool for what she calls a corporate machine that drives war interests for profit. And it was in this conversation that Ryan then said, we saw what... Sorry, I'm not quoting here. I'm more or less paraphrasing. He was saying that we saw what happened when we gave Taliban the room to breathe and to grow. When that happened, he said, we have to be engaged. In opposition, Tulsi stated that this was unacceptable and that we absolutely need to withdraw from Afghanistan. Ryan's response was that essentially last time we did something of the sort, Taliban flew a plane into our buildings, I think was something along the lines of what he said. Tulsi, with almost a grin on her face, was quickly able to jump on this mistake. Obviously, it was Al-Qaeda that performed the attacks on the Twin Towers, not the Taliban. Now, based off of his backtracking, Ryan went on to say that the Taliban had shielded those who had perpetrated 9/11, the event he was referring to, of course. One can assume that this was probably just some slip of the tongue. I'm sure that Representative Ryan is fully aware of who actually perpetrated the attacks. However, this is a decent little bit of a flub in wording, probably something that will be able to grab headlines as publications choose to write about it. I'm sure some attack pieces will be written. I do think that Tulsi was very smart, however, to jump on this moment as an opportunity to kind of belittle her opponent in a way. However, I feel as though that kind of friction is generally what Democratic voters are looking to avoid in this election cycle, where I think the common sentiment is more based on who can beat Donald Trump and kind of unifying together as a party, or at least I would hope that that is the sentiment. Anyways, this friction has gotten me a bit off topic. I should move on now to my losers of tonight's debate. So, really, for me, there were 3 primary losers. I felt like Inslee did a good job with his speaking when he was given the opportunity. However, he was given almost half a minute less speaking time than the next lowest candidate, about 5 minutes, which is less than half of the amount of time that both Cory Booker and Beto O'Rourke each spoke. As solid as a message can be for a candidate who is currently polling, let me pull up my numbers here, 0.4%, speaking 5 minutes in a 2-hour debate is just simply not enough to give yourself the exposure you need to allow your campaign to grow. As strong as you can make your message as possible, it's just not going to work that way. Another loser of the night, probably the primary... Actually, no, I'm going to skip him for now and I'll do that one last. Beto O'Rourke, I felt, also did not do the greatest job. He was able to speak the second most amount of time, 10 minutes and 4 seconds. However, I felt like, and I might be exposing a little bit of bias here, though I will be quick to say that I don't particularly dislike Beto. I just definitely have, there have been a lot of, he is a victim of the media's overhype early on in the election season. And because of that, a lot of his issues so far are already well documented. Now, I'm going to stop with those kind of criticisms now because I don't want you to feel as though, as of right now at least, this is not an opinion piece. This is supposed to be a little bit more, this is all kind of an opinion piece, whatever. But my point is, I don't necessarily like or dislike his campaign. That will be for another video where I will discuss that. I just think that tonight was very representative of a lot of the issues that his critics have had with his campaign previously. I think that he came to the table with some good talking points, definitely a lot of ideology, a lot of speaking of kind of bringing everyone together, bringing everyone into the conversation, and not a lot of legitimate policy. However, there were some encouraging signs of legitimate policy in his speaking, where he came out as very, very pro-renewable, but, just kind of saying things like bring everyone into the conversation or move forward together. Kind of these, similarly to Booker, redundant talking points, but unlike Booker, with a little bit less, I want to say, substance to them. He also fell into a little bit of a trap and came outright. I think he was the only candidate to have made the statement that it is time to begin impeachment proceedings. Now, impeachment is not something that polls well among voters. It does poll a little bit better among Democratic voters. I think close to 65%. But among general voters, I think the number is somewhere in the 30s. This is also, of course, coming after the recent news that it seems Nancy Pelosi and the House of Representatives will not be, at least for the moment, pursuing a path to impeachment. Delaney was able to take advantage of this moment and say that he trusts Pelosi, and went on to say that most Americans don't care about impeachment, which is somewhat supported by the polling, I would say. But that's kind of not the point right now. Beto came in at the beginning speaking Spanish. He was the first of 3 candidates to do so. I believe the other 2 were Cory Booker and then Julian Castro. Beto also managed to be, of course, on the losing end of Castro's beneficial little speech on immigration. I think that may have cost him some serious points. Not to say that he was wrong, but I would say that certainly Castro came out on top of that interaction. I think a lot of his speech time, despite being in second, can also be attributed to his manner of speech, which often came off as a little bit slow in pace. He has a very particular way of delivery. It's very much his, I would say, but that did lead him to going over his time slot on many times where it may have actually been unnecessary if he had spoken at the pace of some of these other candidates. I don't know. His hand movements were always interesting as always too. Another loser of this debate, I would have to say, is also Elizabeth Warren. I know that's a little bit confusing, but in the second half, it hardly seemed like she was even able to get a word in edgewise. She was given very few opportunities to speak, and she seemingly took very few opportunities herself to interject in the conversation, though with this sentiment of maybe wanting unity among the party that could benefit her in time, where she wasn't, over aggressive and stepping on any hands. However, I am a bit even surprised now looking at the amount of time that each of the candidates were able to speak and seeing her in third place, because as extensive and thorough as her speaking was in the first half, in the second half, I just felt the conversation did not go to her very much. And on top of that, she did not take the opportunities to interject herself back into the conversation when she was out of it for long periods of time. Now, the ultimate loser of this debate, I would have to say, is Delaney. He seems like a genuine guy with a lot of true intentions to me. However, that didn't seem to help him much on the stage, where he came third to last in amount of time spoken, much like the other candidates at the bottom of the speaking poll, with just about a 0.4 polling showing as of right now, 0.4%, I mean, which, again, as I said before, is just simply not enough to carry your name through the conversation in the future, and he will have to do better to expose himself. Beyond that, I think he did, well, okay, he will have to do better, but he has to find a better way to do that as well, because multiple times tonight, he did try to interject himself into the conversation. I think he was silenced on 3 separate occasions without being able to speak, because he either waited too long to speak or, that's probably what it was, really, honestly, was that he sometimes would let these conversations play out a little bit too long before he took his opportunity to interject himself into the conversation. And because of that, it seemed like he was not able to get into the conversation on several of the main issues. This is kind of ironic in the light of one of his only quotes that I think I took down from tonight, which was, "We need to get things done." A sentiment that he was not able to fulfill himself over the course of the debate, if I'm being completely and utterly honest. I do think he was able to salvage at least his dignity at the end. With his closing speech, he said a line that resonated with me, and personally, I don't know very much about his campaign to this point. I haven't fully delved into the research on some of the lower ranking candidates thus far, but it did come across as pretty genuine to me based off of what he is advocating for and how he goes about it, which is with a heavy emphasis on building bipartisan coalitions in a time where partisanship has become increasingly prevalent in our government. But what he said was, "I don't want to be your president to be president. I want to do the job. It's not about me." And I think that in that sense, he was definitely able to salvage at least his dignity. However, I do think that it was too late to really, it's definitely a missed opportunity. He's not going to get too many opportunities on this stage. He's not going to get too many opportunities to be on a stage without Biden and Sanders and Kamala and Buttigieg, who will all be certainly fighting over the conversation tomorrow night, I believe. Oh wow, a new poll just got published that has Elizabeth Warren. Sorry, this is a little bit of breaking news. Off topic. Elizabeth Warren just came in polling from the Economist YouthGov from the dates June 22nd to June 25th at 19%. That's 4% ahead of what they polled Bernie Sanders at, 15%, and 2% over Sanders' overall average poll, according to RealClearPolitics.com, where he sits at 16.9% on average. Biden, meanwhile, is polling just 6% ahead of that, according to Economist YouthGov. So that is quite an interesting development for Warren, who has seemingly been surging, while Biden has astronomical lead has slowly reduced. He still has about a 15% lead overall on any other candidate, but if you look at polling trends, that is a significant reduction from just a couple of weeks ago when he was polling at 41.4%. Overall, just by looking at technically less than half of the candidates that qualified for the debates, but less than half of the candidates seeking the Democratic nomination in this election cycle. But in this half of those on the debate stage, we can already see quite a vast amount of personality, a lot of variety, despite there being what we can see as the general Democratic platform. The party lines are certainly becoming clear on certain issues, such as climate change. I felt most of them agreed on issues like that, but then you see a bit of a split on issues of healthcare, where half and half of the candidates are supporting single payer or opt-in as opposed to Medicare for all. And then you even have Amy Klobuchar, who comes in with her own what she calls Medicare Advance, a middle position. We see a large variety of personality within these issues. Within similar ideology, we see a lot of out-of-the-box maybe ways of solving these issues, or tackling them, however you'd want to put it. I think looking forward, Warren will continue to do well in the polls. She lived up to expectations tonight, I think, as the top polling candidate on the stage. She was able to control a lot of the conversation and get her points across to now a nationally televised audience, to thunderous applause from those in the room often. I think that despite not polling very high, Castro was able to differentiate himself as a candidate with a lot of passion and as a legitimate contender, despite not polling anywhere near the top-ranking candidates as of right now. I think we can see a lot of movement going forward. I think Gillibrand presented herself presented herself as calm and collected, as advertised. And I think that she could maybe perhaps see a steady rise in the polls because of tonight. I think Beto is a bit of a wild card in this respect, as he has been, honestly, for much of his political career overall. That's probably the best way that you could describe him, is a bit of a wild card. He was able to speak a lot tonight. Whether that speech resonates with a lot of the listeners, I do not know. He did receive decent amounts of applause at certain points, but there is the matter of the fact that in the polling, since he peaked in third place, somewhere close to 9%, I believe. 9.5% back on April 4th. Since Biden announced his campaign, even before then, he was in a bit of trouble, but he's dipped from third place down to, I believe, sixth place now, and he's sitting at 3.3%, and I'm not sure that he necessarily did enough tonight to reverse that trend, or perhaps he may see a steady gain, because he did manage to get a decent amount across, for sure. I think that he is a bit of a polarizing figure early on. I think that if you love him, you love him. If you don't, you don't. You really don't. So I could perhaps see a bit of a steady rise for him. However, I don't see this as being even necessarily the beginning of a recovery from his drop from 9.5 to, again, 3.3%. I felt the rest of the candidates, maybe Gabbard can find some way of capitalizing off of this in the polls, but her included when it comes to Delaney, de Blasio, Ryan, and Inslee, I think that you have some potential there. I think that they said a lot of things that I personally liked. I felt like they were able to present themselves in good ways when they were able to speak. However, that is not necessarily enough to differentiate yourself in this crowded field, and I don't see any of them making the largest of gains tonight unless their messages, as short as they were, managed to resonate with lots of viewers. Foreign policy came up fairly briefly, even though some might say that it's a big issue. We've been engaged in 3 foreign wars: Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Of the 3, really only Afghanistan ever came up, and that was mainly in reference to the Taliban. Nothing to do with ISIL. Not very much in ways of foreign election interference, specifically Russia. There wasn't a lot of focus on China, though I would say that they were mentioned. Each candidate was asked, to varying degrees of success for the commentators, what they saw as the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States, and they were asked to give 1 or 2 word answers. Many of them obviously used this as an opportunity to try to get certain further agendas across, because as I'm sure many of them and many viewers felt like this issue was fairly glossed over in the debate, and what I think will be, at least going forward, a more driving issue in the campaigns, specifically because when it comes down to looking at big corporations breaking up big tech, Medicare for all, climate change, we will see a lot of redundancies between these campaigns. However, when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to trade, I think we see a lot of differing opinions across each candidate. Anyways, their list of, in order that I believe they said them in, of the greatest geopolitical threats to the United States goes as follows: John Delaney, China and nuclear weapons; Jay Inslee, President Trump; Tulsi Gabbard, nuclear war; Amy Klobuchar, China and Iran. God, I said that kind of funny. I'm sorry. Beto O'Rourke, climate change; Elizabeth Warren, climate change; Cory Booker, nuclear proliferation and climate change; Julian Castro, China and climate change; Tim Ryan, China; Bill de Blasio, Russia. Another important moment, I think it's nice to note that Gabbard was forced to explain, as expected, her past LGBTQ opposition. Some of you might already be aware of this, but coming up as a politician in the early 2000s, Gabbard, who comes from a conservative family, was an advocate for her father's anti-homosexual organization, and had made some anti-LGBTQ comments. When faced with the question, she says that she's grateful for those in the LGBTQ communities who share their aloha with her throughout her personal journey. She even went to say as far as that she had served on the battlefield alongside LGBTQ comrades, and she would be willing to die for them just as they had been for her. Some of the Democrats opened up the door to prosecuting Trump in the future. Beto O'Rourke and John Delaney both left open the possibility that they could pursue criminal cases against Donald Trump after he leaves office, assuming that they're elected in 2020, obviously. Donald Trump, who previously had listed this group as an unexcited group of people and said that the debate would probably be boring, would later tweet out during the debate that it, in fact, he did think that it was boring. He also said, "Sorry, I'm on Air Force One, off to save the free world." There did seem to be a general sentiment in support for renewing the nuclear deal with Iran, or as Amy Klobuchar called the deal, imperfect, but would want to negotiate us back into the deal. Others thought that maybe the deal should be renegotiated and not entered as is. And Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard, a very vocal critic of current U.S. conflicts, said that war with Iran would be far more devastating and far more costly than those in Iraq or Afghanistan. No war with Iran. She made that very clear. There was actually, surprisingly enough, little talk about the current polling statuses of the candidates. There was no mention of the smaller grassroots campaigns and their so far minimal support in the percentages. Sorry, not all of them, but specifically those polling under 1%. There was no mention, kind of across the board, there was no mention of Beto's steep decline. There was no mention of Senator Warren's status as being pretty much about 10% ahead of almost every single person on that stage. Beyond that, I felt like, personally, I thought or expected that they were going to talk more about Joe Biden. And there was a lot of talk that how they handled the conversation around Biden would drive the conversation going forward. There has been a bit of what has been described as a circling fire squad around Joe Biden a little bit early on, as obviously each of these candidates' hope is to eventually surpass him in the polls, and he is by far the leader in currently in the polls. However, there was absolutely no mention of him. So looking forward, I think that with him on the stage tomorrow, I could see that becoming, with him and just generally more of the high-profile candidates tomorrow, we will be seeing Joe Biden, we will be seeing Bernie Sanders, we will be seeing Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. Kind of a little bit more of the major league type. If past divisions of of debates had been used to apply to this one, essentially they would have all been in the main debate. While Warren was the only candidate that could be categorized as such that was stuck in what could be categorized as an undercard debate due to polling numbers. Tomorrow we'll be seeing some more unique platforms on the stage. We'll see Bernie Sanders continuing to talk about what is now a pretty nationally covered idea of his self-avowed democratic socialism. Can a socialist have a legitimate chance of winning the Democratic nomination? Will the smaller candidates be able to get any speaking time in edgewise with all these larger candidates up on the stage? We already saw today that aside from Castro and Klobuchar, the rest of the candidates who were polling at less than 1% really had a hard time getting themselves asserted into the conversation. One could expect that issue could become worse with the main candidates up on the stage. We will see Mayor Pete Buttigieg coming into the conversation amid a flurry of recent controversies surrounding his handling of the police in his town of South Bend, where he is the mayor. We will see what can only be categorized as by far one of the more unique platforms to be on the stage and somehow entering the mainstream conversation this year, which is Andrew Yang and his platform that is mainly based around a $1,000 a month freedom dividend, or universal basic income as it's better known, along with his criticisms of circumcision, which he says that pro-circumcision advocates will be on the wrong side of history. But I digress. Thank you so much. This actually went about 15 minutes longer than I expected. I look forward to improving my style as I go forward. I know that I use certain stuttering words like and perhaps the cutting of the audio on this was not done very well because I have this nifty little pause button that on my recorder, so occasionally that's probably the skips that you'll be hearing, or occasionally a word might be cut off. I just did it there. For the most part, I actually expect these videos to be to actually have video and not just audio. For the sake of expediency, I opted to go with just the audio for these debate breakdowns and perhaps most likely for the introduction. I will be putting that introduction video out hopefully soon, where I can break down to you the further logistics of how I plan to go about this show. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Some interesting rankings, multiple tiers of rankings too, and thorough meme analysis. I plan to make this into sort of a game, an informative game of sorts, and I hope that you'll all have fun. I hope that you were able to bear with my questionable public speaking abilities. Not that I'm actually in public at all. Look at me. Now I'm rambling. Anyways, this was Noah Inatsugu on Moving Forward 2020 Vision. Thank you all so much for joining me in the first episode, and have a good night.